Hello everyone, dear friends. The unexpected storm. Can Diep navigate hardship without James? The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken worry. For days, the world had felt eerily silent to James. Diep was gone. Not just out of sight, but utterly vanished, leaving behind a void that swallowed hope with each passing hour. His mother, a pillar of strength, now carried the burden of silent tears, a testament to the raw fear gripping their hearts. James knew he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for the woman who tried so hard to hide her trembling resolve. The storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. The frantic calls to comrade then yielded nothing. Still no news, the voice on the other end echoed, a grim refrain that had become agonizingly familiar. James had scoured every corner, every familiar haunt, every place he thought Diep might have sought refuge. Each dead end was a fresh stab, each unanswered question a growing knot of despair. His mother's suggestion to pursue John's associates, a desperate long shot, had already been explored. John's captured henchmen vehemently denied any involvement in Diep's disappearance, yet a gnawing suspicion lingered in James's mind. Could they be lying? Was Diep hidden away, terrified and alone, or had something far more sinister befallen her? The thought was a bitter taste in his mouth. Work, a once consuming passion, now felt like a hollow obligation. He went through the motions at the lumber yard, the hum of machinery a dull drone against the frantic beat of his heart. His foreman, concerned, spoke of production figures and new contracts, but James's thoughts were miles away, consumed by the image of Diep. He delegated responsibilities, a rare act for him, knowing his focus had to be singular. Find Diep. Diep is a good girl. You must find her, his foreman implored, a sentiment that echoed his own desperate plea to the universe. He found himself at the old, abandoned shed, a place that once held so much warmth and laughter. The overgrown vines on the trellis, once vibrant and fruitful, now hung limply, mirroring the desolation in his soul. This was their spot, where they had shared dreams and quiet moments. If only he had listened to his father, who cautioned him about their differences. Perhaps then, this agonizing emptiness could have been avoided. But regret was a heavy cloak, suffocating him. He shook his head, a surge of renewed determination coursing through him. He couldn't afford to wallow. Diep needed him. A glimmer of hope arrived in the form of a referral to a local woman, a resourceful individual known for her ability to find anything or anyone. Hyen, with a shrewd glint in her eye, listened to James's desperate plea. The price was steep, -20 million VND upfront, with a promise of more if Diep was found swiftly. James didn't hesitate. Money was meaningless compared to Diep's safety. As Hyen disappeared, a fleeting thought crossed James's mind. Just find her, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, a different kind of kindness unfolded across town. Officer Lee, with his stern but compassionate demeanor, stumbled upon a mother and child, collapsed in the rain. He and Comrade GC, true to their duty, offered aid, driving the weary pair home and returning with provisions, a carton of instant noodles and some milk. It was a small act of humanity, a ripple of good in a world that felt increasingly bleak. Perhaps, James thought, as he continued his relentless search, such acts of kindness might somehow, in some unforeseen way, lead him closer to Diep. The search continued, expanding beyond the initial perimeters. James instructed Tune to print missing person flyers, plastering them in every corner, every business, every place Diep might have frequented. He yearned for a sign, a whisper, anything that would tell him she was safe. He felt a deep apology to his mother, who, despite her own sorrow, constantly tried to reassure him. "Don't cry, Mom. I promise I'll find her," he had choked out, trying to project a strength he barely possessed. The unexpected storm had indeed struck, and James, without Diep by his side, was left to weather its brutal force, clinging to the fading embers of hope that she would, somehow, find her way back to him. "It sounds like you want me to continue the story about James and Diep," picking up where the unexpected storm left off. I'll make sure the narrative flows smoothly and maintains the emotional tone, a glimmer of hope, a shadow of doubt. Days bled into nights, each sunrise bringing renewed determination for James, and each sunset, a fresh wave of quiet desperation. The flyers, plastered across every lamppost and storefront, were a constant, silent plea to the bustling city. His phone, clutched in his hand, seemed to vibrate with phantom calls, his heart leaping with every unknown number, only to sync with each irrelevant message. The lumber yard, once a source of comfort and purpose, now felt like a cage. He went through the motions, delegating tasks, his mind always elsewhere, picturing Diep, wondering if she was cold, hungry, or worse. Then a call. It wasn't Diep, but a hushed voice from Hyan. "We have a lead," she whispered, the words a lifeline in a turbulent sea. James's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't ask for details, only for directions, his feet already moving before Hyan had finished speaking. He found her in a quiet, unassuming part of the city, a place he hadn't thought to look. But it wasn't Diep. It was a young woman, frail and hesitant, her eyes darting nervously. Hyan explained she was a distant relative of John's, found hiding after the arrests. She heard things, Hyan said, her voice low. Whispers of another location, a place John used for special dealings. The woman, terrified but clutching a small, worn photograph of Diep, finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, recounting fragments of conversations she'd overheard. John, it seemed, had a hidden facility, an old, isolated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where he conducted his most illicit operations. And the woman hinted at a reason for Diep's abduction beyond just silencing her, something more personal, more sinister. The information was vague, shrouded in fear, but it was the most concrete lead James had received. The reckoning. James immediately contacted Comrade Than, his voice tight with urgency. The police, though skeptical of information from such a source, agreed to investigate. The old warehouse was indeed there, dilapidated and seemingly abandoned, but a faint light flickered within, a chilling confirmation of the informant's tale. The raid was swift, a blur of flashing lights and shouted commands. James stood by, his fists clenched, his breath held captive in his chest. Inside, the scene was chaotic. John's remaining associates, caught off guard, put up a brief struggle before being apprehended. And there, in a dimly lit room, huddled in a corner, was Diep. She was pale, her clothes disheveled, but she was alive. Relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over James. He rushed to her, his voice hoarse with emotion, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Diep, trembling, clung to him, tears finally flowing freely. "James," she whispered, her voice weak but undeniably real. The details of what happened to Diep, the full extent of John's depravity, would unravel in the coming days. But in that moment, under the harsh glare of police lights, surrounded by the echoes of a nightmare, only one truth mattered: Diep was safe. The storm hadn't fully passed, not yet, but the worst of it was over. And James knew, as he held her close, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The love they shared, tested by the unexpected storm, had proven stronger than any darkness. The long road to healing, the initial euphoria of finding Diep, was quickly followed by the daunting reality of her recovery. Though physically unharmed in the immediate sense, the ordeal had left invisible scars. Diep was withdrawn, her laughter muted, her eyes often distant, haunted by memories James couldn't fully comprehend. She flinched at sudden movements and startled at loud noises. James tried to be her rock, showering her with quiet comfort and unwavering patience. His mother, too, hovered, offering gentle words and nourishing meals, her earlier tears now replaced with a deep, tender concern. The police investigation continued, unraveling the full extent of John's network. His arrest and the subsequent dismantling of his operations brought a sense of justice, but it did little to erase the trauma Diep had endured. James spent less time at the lumber yard and trusting more to Tune, his priority now solely on Diep. He'd sit with her for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about trivial things, trying to coax her back to the light. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her mood, to offer a comforting hand when anxiety tightened its grip, to celebrate the smallest victories, a genuine smile, a shared laugh, a fleeting moment of peace. Rebuilding and remembering, weeks turned into months. Slowly, painstakingly, Diep began to heal. There were good days, and there were setbacks, but each passing day brought a little more of the old Diep back. She started to venture out again, first with James by her side, then tentatively on her own. She revisited the old shed, the place of their shared dreams. This time, however, James had been there before her. The barren trellis was now adorned with new, vibrant vines, carefully tended, a symbol of renewed hope and growth. He had also added a small, comfortable bench where their old one once stood, a silent promise of future moments together. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on their faces, Diep turned to James. Her voice, though still soft, held a new strength. "I want to start fresh," she said, her eyes meeting his, clear and resolute. "Not just for myself, but for us. The storm ... it showed me what truly matters." James nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and love. The journey had been arduous, marked by fear, despair, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. But through it all, their bond had not only endured, but had deepened. The unexpected storm had indeed tested them, pushing them to their limits, but they had weathered it together. And now, standing on the other side, they were ready to rebuild, stronger and more appreciative of the precious calm that follows the fiercest of tempests. New beginnings, shared paths. Diep starting fresh wasn't a sudden, dramatic declaration, but a gradual unfolding of quiet strength. She returned to her design work, initially approaching it with a tentative hand, as if testing the waters. But soon, the familiar spark reignited in her eyes. Her sketches, once hesitant, became bold and vibrant, reflecting a spirit that refused to be dimmed. James watched, a silent supporter, offering praise and encouragement, but mostly just being there. He saw her rediscovering her passion, and it was a joy to witness. The lumber business, too, began to thrive again. James, having entrusted more responsibility to Tune during Diep's recovery, found himself with a stronger, more efficient team. He dedicated his time to strategic partnerships, forging new alliances that diversified their reach and solidified their position in the market. The challenges he faced felt different now, no longer shadowed by a consuming dread, but met with a newfound resilience. He had learned the hard way that even in business, relationships and trust were paramount, a lesson forged in the fires of personal hardship. A future built on resilience, their evenings often ended at home, a sanctuary of peace after the day's endeavors. The shared meals, the quiet conversations, the comforting presence of each other, these were the simple, profound joys that now anchored their lives. Diep occasionally spoke of her ordeal, not with bitterness, but with a surprising clarity, as if processing it aloud helped her finally release its grip. James listened, his heart aching for what she had endured, yet immensely proud of her courage. One crisp evening, sitting on the newly placed bench by the now lush green trellis, Diep gently placed her hand on James's. "You know," she began, a soft smile gracing her lips, "the storm ... It took a lot from me, but it also showed me how much I have. How much we have." James squeezed her hand, understanding unspoken. The pain of the past would always be a part of their story, a testament to their endurance, but it would not define their future.